Hey, David here. We are live at the Detroit Historical Museum. So it's the very end of the Jewish Detroit exhibit, Hastings. This was our home featuring Jewish Detroit from 1880 till 1930, which was in a section of Detroit called Hastings. So here with my mom and using StreamYards. I'm not sure if I'm live on Twitter also, but I just thought I'd record this. So just looking at a map. I'm saying the current Detroit Historical Museum is here. The area covered in the exhibit is here, which was the Hastings Street area, which was the major Jewish neighborhood in Detroit from 1880 till 1930. So currently that's downtown area, near the Renaissance Center, but it would have been the major Jewish area later known as Black Bottom, where Jews had the first major establishment. I mean, there was Jewish history going back in Detroit, maybe even more than 100 years before that, Ann Arbor, but just a handful of people. So this would have been the first major Jewish area, starting with German settlers, Eastern Europeans. So you'd see a lot of sponsors. The Jewish community raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to create this exhibit and get it hosted at the museum. There's currently a tour group here, so you're just looking. People came from Europe, um, saying the period of Hastings Street when Jews were coming here was a boom for America. Economy was doing very well, and auto industry was first starting. People were coming here for a start new economic opportunity. The main reason why so many Jews came here was economic opportunity, and the economic opportunity was mostly connected to the auto industry. And Albert Kahn. I went to the Albert Kahn exhibit um, in this very same room, which would have been a like 3 years ago. They had the Albert Kahn, so Albert Kahn would have been in this area, who became uh, Henry Ford's architect and probably one of the more famous Detroiters. So they just put together some of what Jewish Detroit was like from 1880 till 1930. And that point in Jewish Detroit history, there would have been kind of like a shtetl. Probably a lot of the people may have spoken Yiddish. There would have been kosher stores, synagogues, all put in the same area. Um, it also would have been around the same time the African Americans started coming to Detroit. And Detroit had a long history of reform. There was a strong Orthodox element. Yeshiva Beth Yehuda would have been, I think, founded in the I don't even know sure if Yeshiva Beth Yehuda might come later. So the Hastings Street neighborhood was home to 13 synagogues and many smaller houses of worship. At that time, all were Orthodox. You have Temple Bethel. You see a Jewish education. 1899 was the first Talmud Torah. Um, Before Yeshiva Beth Yehuda, which is now like 102 years old. So I'm not sure. Yeshiva Beth Yehuda may have came later. So the Shalom Aleichem Institute, the Arbiter Ring, the Workman's Circle. David's grandfather's grandfather, Rabbi Bamberger, was brought to America to work for the Workman's Circle, first in New York and then Chicago. But at the time, certain organizations still around, Hebrew Free Loan. Um, some videos. I guess some of this is interactive. Um, Back in the old days of horse-drawn carriages, like Albert Kahn started his first job if you remember this, in the same room was grooming horses. Um, Here's some old exhibits from historic Detroit. Try like a recreation of a Jewish room. It's just kind of like random stuff. Um, just the Ginsburg Library. I never even heard of that. Branch of the Detroit Public Library, 1913. In the Hastings area, People's Theater and Movie Theater, Abraham Caro, Paul Ehrlich. Uh, you never even heard of that. You can see we got Henry Glicksman, Ford Motor Company. I'm also going to go to the African exhibit on the other side, so if you finish here, I'll be there. Um, so there was got my mom here. This exhibit is ending this week, so this Yiddish directory. Um, so if you're looking in the Hastings area, you see red dots were address listed in the directory, green synagogues, black boxes Jewish organization, yellow box Hebrew school, purple box arts and cultural institution, light blue box Jewish business, dark blue box public sector institution frequented by Jewish community. And you can see in Hastings Street, um, maybe even 50% of the residences were Yiddish, were Jewish. So you say Hastings Street was a dominated Jewish neighborhood where maybe even the majority of the residents were Jewish. And like I'd mentioned on Week in Review many times, there's a trend for African Americans to move in, Jews to move out of the neighborhood, and African Americans to move into the former Jewish neighborhoods. So you see here after World War I, Jews moved north. Hastings Street became home to thousands of African Americans. They migrated from the south. Um, Housing discrimination forced them to Hastings Street, known as Black Bottom, south of Gratiot, and Paradise Valley. Residents paid overpriced rent. So, as I mentioned, Deborah Dashmore in her talk at Temple Bethel a few weeks ago on Jewish migration patterns in Detroit, there was a common trend where Jews moved into Jewish neighborhoods, and then the blacks started moving in, and as the blacks became more and more dominant in the neighborhood, the Jews moved out, and it can create that continual pattern all the way to the suburbs, like to Southfield where I live, even and it's like that in almost every major urban area in um, the East Coast in the United States. So then you have combination of black and Jewish um, business, where a period of time Jews and blacks lived together until eventually almost all the Jews abandon the previous neighborhood and becomes mostly a black neighborhood. Then you have destruction of the neighborhood, 1940s, thriving neighborhood, 125,000 African Americans. Most of the buildings were owned by absentee white landlords, including Jews. Um, Eventually was condemned, slums and blighted, and a lot of it was destroyed for the Highway 375. So the former neighborhood was largely torn down to build a highway. So if you're looking basic patterns of general immigration and Jewish migration, some of David's ancestors, Jewish ancestors, came from German Jewish background and some from Russian Jewish background, and came around the time David's grandfather's grandfather, Rabbi Bamberger, came to America in 1880 at the height of German Jewish immigration to be a rabbi for the Workmen's Circle, and the rest of his family, my mother's side, came from the Ukraine around before World War I, which is the peak time for Jewish migration from both areas, and so the European history. So let me just take a quick look also at the other exhibits. They had an exhibit from the Detroit Pistons, the Bad Boys, when David was growing up, like Isaiah Thomas. But they have their exhibit Doorway to Freedom at the um, African Americans. The Detroit obviously used to be the most populated African American city, and I think now Nashville, Tennessee, just surpassed that. But Detroit now is like 70% African American, and the long history of African Americans. So they have an exhibit here, which is even bigger than the other one, starting with the Underground Railroad. Um, First blacks came. Maybe there were a handful before, but the first blacks start coming to Detroit, like the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s before the Civil War. So there's some escaped blacks that come to Detroit and make their way to Canada. The Fugitive Slave Act, God forbid, if blacks are caught in Detroit, could be sent back to slavery in the South. Besides for the Fugitive Slave Act, but some made their way to Canada, and so Detroit had stops on the Underground Railroad. So here, the Vigilant Committee, 1842, um, promoted equality through nonviolent means, included blacks and whites. William Lampert, William Webb, George de Baptiste, and committee aided approximately 15,000 freedom seekers during the 1850s. The Detroit Daily Advertiser reported that in a single day, 1861, they helped 190 people reach their freedom. So Detroit already had a sizable black community going back into the 1840s, 50s, um, before the Civil War. So it looks like this room has, um, just some stories, and you're saying a stone's throw to freedom, reaching to Canada. So if, God forbid, with the Fugitive Slave Act, blacks that were caught in Detroit could still be returned to slavery. Although you had free blacks, you could have free blacks, but if they um, so if it was a fugitive slave, God forbid, they had to make their way to Canada. Detroit was a stop along the way, and see, yeah, and I'm not. I know little of the basics of African American history, so I just figured I'd um, take a quick look at this also, and so let's continue. So we're looking at the that part was the slave era. I'm not sure if it goes chronologically. Um, the Kercheval incident. Um, I'm not even sure. This looks like. See if I get a date. This is 1966 already. So this is already looking at the 1966, 67 riots. So 1960s, the media landscape was much different than today. There was no cable, satellite, or internet. To get news, Detroit audience had limited choices. There were two daily newspapers, um, and so these are all um, reprints of articles from the 60s leading into the 67 riots, revolution, and a lot of the racial tension in the 60s. But it looks like they have a little bit more. So here we got Black Bottom, which is like the Hastings Street, Paradise Valley. Detroit Black Bottom resident neighborhood was home to immigrants as early as the 1830s due to restrictive real estate covenants prohibiting habitation of some ethnic groups, primarily blacks and Jews. In much of the city, Black Bottom became home to most African Americans and the center of black-owned businesses. During the Great Migration, the area became severely overcrowded, with residents living in some of the oldest housing stock in the city. So this is corresponding to the Hastings Street Jewish area. Blacks and Jews were moving into the area about the same time. Detroit's Urban League, the NAACP, formed in 1909. The first Detroit office is in 1912. Here you got the Great Migration. Much of the 20th century, black residents in the Deep South moved north and west in an event known as the Great Migration. I just took the great courses. Teaching company just came out with a new course on the Great Migration. Highly recommend it. Just finished that one. Fleeing the harsh repression of poverty in the Jim Crow South, the migrants came to cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia in search of jobs and personal freedom. Detroit was particularly attractive. Automobile manufacturing offered good wages for entry level jobs. Most of the migrants were farmers who adapted gradually to urban life. Movement began about 1915, extended two waves through the early 1960s, dramatically shifting demographics in many large cities. Coincidentally, good jobs in Detroit also attracted poor white farmers from Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Some of these Southerners retained racist elements of their culture and made Detroit the northern seat of the Ku Klux Klan. Great Depression. Okay, so the 1920s. Some nationally known entertainers, music, center of some African American life, not necessarily as big as like Chicago or um, New York, but you see like Duke Ellington. Detroit was on the stop. One of the major cities. So the major black entertainers that toured the U.S. Detroit was definitely one of the places and produced. Later Motown. Red Summer 1919, race riots erupted in more than 30 cities across the U.S. Detroit was not among them. So the 1919 race riots were, Detroit was untouched by that. Interesting. Um, this is very famous in Detroit history. The trial of Dr. Ossian Sweet, prominent African American physician, purchased a home in all-white East Side neighborhood. God forbid, whites swarmed uh, his house, and he ended up shooting somebody. And the famous attorney from the Evolution Scopes monkey trial, Clarence Darrow, uh, defended him. Ended up in first a hung jury, and he was tried again, found not guilty. And that's a famous case. In the house, I think, is still like a tourist site. Um, as mentioned, Underground Railroad uh, loans. So a hateful resurgence. Um, so initially, the labor unions were slow to accept African Americans in their rank. During the 1930s, this trend started to change, and industrial unions like the UAW fought for equality in the wartime workplace. Post-war, these unions played a big role in the civil rights movement, combating discrimination in the workplace through the 50s and 60s. In these days, African Americans are a huge part of the labor unions like the UAW. Hateful resurgence. Surge of Southerners to Detroit during the Great Migration created tensions over housing, jobs, and resources. Elevated racism led to resurgence of Ku Klux Klan activity. Demonstrations on Woodward Avenue drew thousands of marchers. The Klan burned a cross in front of City Hall on Christmas Eve, 1923, and attempted to influence mayoral politics. Despite this rise in the early 1920s, the resurgence fizzled out early in the following decade. Wartime, Occupy Woolworths, um, discrimination, God forbid, 30s, public housing, violence. Um, so this is a backdrop to what culminated in 1967, de facto school segregation. Um, Brown versus Board of Education, um, and busing, housing struggles, still struggle till today. Um, Race riot 1943, tensions in Detroit over housing, transportation, food, and jobs were high. Racial tensions were higher. For the first time, whites and black occupied the same workplaces and public spaces and lived closer than ever. On Sunday, June 20th, 1943, several fights broke out at Belle Isle Park. Rumors that blacks had thrown a white woman and babies off the bridge and vice versa spread throughout the city. Large mobs of whites set cars on fire and attacked black residents. Blacks defended their neighborhood with force. Federal troops stifled the battle after 3 days. 34 people were killed, 25 black and non-white. About 1,800 people were arrested. 75% were black. And you could see expansion of African Americans. So say the Jewish migration pattern is kind of like out this way. So you see there's where blacks move furthest into the suburbs is following the Jewish migration patterns, although blacks population eventually became substantially higher and took over almost all of Detroit. But saying from the 1940s the trajectory of the black population directly follows the Jewish population. Um, Urban renewal, God forbid we mentioned like the destruction of Hastings. Um, After World War II, Detroit was one of several American cities that prioritized slum clearance as a method of urban renewal. Detroit's black communities were disproportionately targeted for demolition as years of overcrowding due to housing segregation and lack of adequate city services had taken their toll. Black Bottom was removed to make room for middle-class housing. By the late 1950s, city planners routed the new interstate highway system through the remaining black neighborhoods. Hastings Street was demolished for the Chrysler Freeway. The government provided little to no relocation assistance to displaced residents and businesses. God forbid this is a problem still facing today. Decaying industry, post-war market fluctuations, the automation led to layoffs and plant relocation outside the city. The economic shift hit Detroit area hard. Industrial online jobs available to African Americans during the war became largely unavailable in the following decade. In 1955, Governor Williams signed into law the Michigan Fair Employment Practices, which banned discrimination based on race or religion in Michigan workforce. Hudson. Police policies, urban police force in the 1950 instituted tough tactics aimed at high crime neighborhoods that were predominantly poor and black. In Detroit, this came in the form of the Big Four patrols, large sedans with one uniformed officer and three plainclothes officers, usually all white. Harassment and intimidation was the prime objective, with arrest and physical abuse a frequent part of the equation. In 1956, Detroit Police Department arrested 73,827 persons, nearly half for investigation without any formal charges. The NAACP in Detroit reviewed 103 citizens' complaints and concluded that the central problem seems to be unprovoked attack by police while questioning, followed by false charges of resisting arrest. In 1960s, only 3.3% of the Detroit police officers were African American in the city. That was nearly one-third black. White officers resisted integration of patrol cars and precincts. Um, there was less pressure to integrate the Detroit Fire Department. In 1967, the force had 1,700 men, only 40 blacks, 2.3%. So now we're getting to 1967. Um, so the other riots, even God forbid, there were racial tensions across the U.S. There you have, Harlem, Watts, California, Cleveland, Newark, New Jersey, Washington, D.C. was an era of uprisings. Um, and eventually the Arab protest, hippie movement in general, Dr. King. Um, there's a walkout at Northern High School. Um, sanctioned segregation, discrimination persisted. 1966 April, more than 2,000 students staged a walkout, issued a list of demands, and formed an alternative education environment, a freedom school, under the direction of professional educators. After 19 days, the Detroit School Board agreed to most of the student demands, and the boycott ended. 1966, the police department had made some progressive changes. The police squad cars were 18% integrated, and officers were ordered to complete community relations and diversity training. George Romney was governor 1963 during the riots. Mitt Romney's father was governor of Michigan through the riots. Obviously, God forbid, we'll see in the next. So the Kirchville Avenue mini riot, 1966, a police confrontation with black activists on the Near East Side threatened to become a major disturbance. Following two arrests, hundreds of people gathered, spurred on by leaders of the adult community movement. Police quickly responded in force. With the help of a rainstorm, dispersed the crowd within 24 hours. Property damage was minor, bolstered by their success. City officials felt they could handle any unrest. 1960s, Detroit's leader of industry might be starting their population decline. From I think there were close to 2 million people maybe in Detroit. Legislation changing the 50s. Um, Detroit Model City Mayor James Kavanaugh leading city towards racial equality, and then concluding these exhibits. God forbid, finally the riots, the revolution, the Algiers hotel motel incidents that precipitated a lot of it. Um, so here you got chronology of events: 67, Saturday, June 22nd. Um, Starting with a little bit of police violence to calling in thousands of troops. Governor Romney calling in the National Guard, and eventually, it looks like about 2 weeks um, that things went on. Police riot, National Guard. See some of the photos. Um, Looks like my mom's about finishing up, ready to go. So um, I won't read through all of these, but God forbid, important history in Detroit. Good to get this. I knew a lot about the Jewish history. I know a lot about this also, but like the Algiers incident and various things. So you about ready to go? Oh, got to be 1 minute. Finish up. So um, the recuperation from the '67 revolution. Part of it becomes um, the migration, white flight from the city, a little bit of healing, reconciliation, but also more a new Detroit that eventually becomes largely ran by blacks, but still problems with industry and economic opportunity and various factors. So um, take off. So did a little stream here. God bless. Thanks for tuning in, and I think we'll be on a Twitter space later this evening with Albert, Adam Green, Kevin McCarran on Twitter this later this evening, and week in review. So thanks for tuning in. God bless.